is a story about Bob. Bob is a boat builder, and this is Bob's boat. He's very smart and likes to be prepared for emergencies. So Bob made 2 of every piece of his boat and stored the duplicate pieces in the hull. He set sail from Athens to Crete. Several days later, he landed in Crete. There he met philosopher Ned, who asked him if he believed his boat was still the original. Bob thought, what a silly question. Of course it's his original boat. Several days went by and Bob had to return to Athens. He set sail, but soon came into some rough weather. Several planks from his boat were torn off by the waves, but as Bob had extra of every piece, he simply replaced them. By the end of his voyage, approximately 25% of the original planks had to be replaced. When he arrived in Athens, he met philosopher Phil, who asked him if he still thought he was on his original boat, seeing as 25% of his parts had been replaced. This question puzzled Bob. After much thought, he decided that as the majority of the boat parts were still original, it was clearly his original boat. Soon after, Bob had to return to Crete. This time, the weather was even worse, and over 50% of his original planks were torn off and had to be replaced. When Bob arrived in Crete, philosopher Ned was waiting for him and asked if he still thought he was on his original boat, now that over half was made with replacement parts. Bob was confused. He was no longer sure if this was his original boat. After several days in Crete, an old friend named Joe asked Bob if he could sail back to Athens with him. Joe was also a shipbuilder and always carried his hammer and nails with him. He was a remarkable guy. Bob agreed, and they both set sail for Athens the next morning. Unfortunately, halfway there, Bob and Joe got into a heated argument. They started fighting. Bob threw Joe off his boat and into the water. Just then, a storm arose, and the boat again was being torn apart, plank by plank, in the rough waves. Bob had to work quickly to replace the parts as they were falling off. Meanwhile, Joe, in the water, equipped with his hammer and nails, grabbed each piece as they fell into the water and put them together in exactly the same way that Bob had originally built the boat. Joe really was a remarkable guy. By the time the storm had blown over, there were 2 boats in the water that looked exactly the same. The one in lead was Bob's, and the one behind was Joe's. When they landed in port in Athens, philosopher Phil asked the 2 men which boat was the original. Bob was entirely confused. He began to wonder if the identity of his boat depended on its component parts all being original. If this were so, even on his first voyage from Athens to Crete, the wood of his boat had weathered just enough to make small changes in its appearance. Were they no longer the original pieces? Bob also questioned how many component parts of a whole have to be replaced before they take on a new identity. 25%? More than 50%? 75%? Can it still be Bob's original boat just because he is on it, regardless of how many parts have been replaced? Can there be 2 original boats? Bob, utterly exasperated, was left wondering about the true nature of his boat. Because Bob was a thinking kind of guy, he also started wondering about his own identity, and if it persisted despite all the changes he had gone through in his lifetime. Years ago, Bob had both his hips replaced. Was he still Bob? Bob had recently had a heart transplant. Did this mean his identity had changed? Perhaps this whole identity thing isn't quite as simple as it first appears. Bob eventually gave up boat building and became a philosopher who wondered most about identity.